G'day guys, and today I'm going to do something a little bit off the cuff and compare modern day hate speech laws to the blasphemy laws of history, such as in the Middle Ages, basically before the Enlightenment, that sort of period. Now back in the day, the good old days, we'll say, if you contradicted the words of the church, you were a heretic, and you blasphemed, you would be punished by the church and effectively the state in some manner. Today, in Australia especially, other countries excluded, such as the United States, as they are protected under the First Amendment, if you say anything hateful, you are punished by the state. Now straight away the comparison can be made between the two. You are being punished by the state for speaking your truth. But I want to go deeper and provide a very specific example. Let us travel back through time to the time of Galileo. Now Galileo was a pretty smart dude, and he discovered many things about reality, such that objects, regardless of their mass, fall down at the same rate. The gravity is a constant, essentially. And when Galileo looked up into the heavens with his telescope, he was able to determine, somehow, that the planets of the solar system did not orbit the Earth, they orbited the Sun. Now this was a big problem for Galileo, as he wanted to speak his truth, but he didn't want to be killed by the church, because the church said that the planets and stars and all the other stuff of the solar system orbited the Earth. Now, if we take this historical example and apply modern standards, Galileo should not be allowed to speak his truth, as it was very hateful and offensive to the power structure of the time, which was the church. If you were some local bishop or religious figure of some kind, and Galileo comes up to your congregation and says, "Hey guys, look at this, look at all this stuff going around the sun. The earth goes around the sun. Look, what this preacher is telling you right here is a lie." People would begin to question other aspects of your religion, and this will cause great anxiety within yourself. You may even be offended that someone would question the will of God, and you may feel humiliated that people would begin to ask you questions. Now those are very specific words I'm using, because they are the words contained within 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act of Australia. Offend, humiliate, words like that. So if you apply 18C to this historical standard, Galileo, as he was, should be placed under house arrest and punished in some kind by the state. The comparison between hate speech and blasphemy laws becomes even closer once you consider that this actually happened. The church, threatened by Galileo, placed him under house arrest. Now this presents a pretty big problem, not just for poor old Galileo stuck at home with no Netflix to watch, but for the human race as a whole. If we fast forward to more recent times, if Galileo's predictions had not been allowed to flourish as they were, if they were brutally suppressed by the hate speech, i.e. blasphemy laws of the time, when we tried to send astronauts and several doggies to other planets, they would have met grisly deaths, as if you believe the Earth is the centre of the solar system and you try to shoot off to Mars, you're going to get it wrong, because the Mars does not orbit Earth, it orbits the Sun. So you have to have a different frame of reference for where you're shooting your rockets off to. If we were unable to send astronauts and dogs into space and things like that, we would not be able to learn about how the solar system is formed and, learn a bit more about reality, which is always cool. Thus, it can clearly be seen how blasphemy laws that restricted speech impacted the progression of science and our interpretation of reality. Now it would be a fair point to make that, hey, shooting off astronauts onto Mars to learn about the history of the solar system isn't that important to the daily life of people. And I agree with you, which is why I have a second example. Now we're going to go back in time, but not quite as far this time. We're going to go back to France, to the world of Louis Pasteur. Now in the time of Pasteur, life was thought to originate via spontaneous generation. Organic life would develop from non-organic life. Things like bad smells would produce flies, pond waste would produce eels, and all sorts of nonsense like that. What Pasteur managed to do is prove the cell theory of life, which is that life comes from other life, and the cell is the origin of life, or the building block of life, I should say. Now let's pause here and apply our modern hate speech laws. Imagine you're some scientist who makes good money travelling around, lecturing at universities, talking about spontaneous generation. You warn people to stay away from bad smells, avoid the pond scum and all this other stuff. You would be threatened by Louis Pasteur, because he's trash canning your entire fiscal situation. you will no longer be able to make any money travelling around and lecturing about spontaneous generation. You may be offended at Louis Pasteur for threatening your livelihood. You may feel humiliated when people start to go, hey, look, this cell theory, it's pretty legit, eh? You're an idiot. You know, why are you telling us all this nonsense about organic life coming from non-organic life? That's ridiculous. Under the current system in Australia, you could have had Louis Pasteur locked up, fined, thrown in jail, exiled, all sorts of nonsense. This would have had disastrous consequences for mankind, as if we never recognised the cell theory as being correct and valid, we never would have gone looking for organic sources for disease. You got to remember, back in the day, back in the medieval times, bad smells, bad airs, bad spirits were thought to cause disease. Malaria, for example, was reported even way back in the Roman times as being spontaneously generated from swamps. With the cell theory of life, we were able to go cutting up mosquitoes and having a look for the plasmodium, little cell that causes malaria. But if we had shut down Louis Pasteur, whether legally through the state or activistically through shouting him down, deplatforming him, taking away his PayPal and that sort of thing, we never would have discovered and eradicated many diseases. I think it is quite obvious what a detriment this would have been to mankind. With the examination of these two cases, the comparison between hate speech laws and blasphemy laws becomes even more ironclad. Laws that restrict speech ultimately prevent us from properly understanding and interpreting reality. If we are unable to discuss the way things are, we are ultimately unable to improve how things are. If Galileo was shouted down and imprisoned as he was, we would be unable to learn about the proper arrangement of the solar system. If Louis Pasteur was shouted down and deplatformed, we would be unable to determine the cell theory of life and ultimately the study of disease. The issue of interpreting reality has not faded away with our mastery of nature and our creation of the modern world. We still need to ask questions in order to improve ourselves. For example, in a multicultural society, what do we do when we encounter a culture that rejects multiculturalism? It is easy to imagine this statement being met with howls of outrage, cries of racist, anti-immigrant, Islamophobia, etc., etc., etc. ad nauseum. It could also easily result in the shutdown of speech, whether legally through the power of the state in 18C, or activistically through the actions of activists who would, call up the advertisers, harangue PayPal, harangue YouTube, harangue Google, get this racist off, and you would be ultimately Alex Jones off the internet. As a humorous aside, it will be incredibly funny if, thousands of years in the future, historians look back to Alex Jones as some kind of Galileo Louis Pasteur type figure who warned us of the interdimensional space demon pedophile vampires. In his much maligned drug-induced trance rant, we shall put it nicely, Alex Jones made a statement concerning reality. I am worried about interdimensional space demon pedophiles abducting and abusing our children. This statement, regardless of how ridiculous it seems, should not be dismissed out of hand, but should be investigated, as far as it is able, in order for us to properly understand reality and adapt our relationship to it in order to live our lives to the fullest. In this video, I hope I was able to make a clear comparison between modern day hate speech laws and the blasphemy laws of history through a few specific examples, two ancient, one more contemporary, we'll say, for Alex Jones. I encourage everyone to draw this comparison within your social as well as internet lives, within the alt media, Bitchute, Minds, Gab, that sort of thing, in order to expose the false religion of multiculturalism, cultural Marxism, and postmodernism that infects our society. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.